So, good morning. Doesn't look like we have a host for this session, so I think maybe I'll just get started. I do actually have a handout, so I'm going to hand this out right at the start. This will be something I reference in the talk, so if you can just take one copy. So normally I would stand up and wander around, but apparently I need to sit here in order to be recorded. Good morning, my name's Paul Stacey. I'm with BC Campus in Vancouver, Canada. I'll be the first speaker, and then there's several others to follow me, so I'll try to go moving along as quickly as I can. If someone can give me an indication, though, of time. Are you going to monitor? Can you monitor? Okay. Is it about 20 minutes per session? Yeah, about 20 minutes per session. So, okay.
20 minutes per session for my questions? Or?
Sure.
Usually about 5 minutes per question.
Okay.
So 25 minutes.
Okay.
Shall I give you 5 minutes more?
Sure, that'd be helpful. So, my session this morning is a little different. I've spent some time looking at and doing some comparative analysis between two different kinds of open educational resource initiatives, those that are funded by foundations, which has largely been the bulk of OER initiatives so far, and those that are actually funded through taxpayer dollars by government public service kinds of initiatives. And I've ended up writing a paper for today's presentation, which I took the time to post online on my blog and was going to invite everyone to follow along with their laptop, but I'm not sure, given the wireless network scenario, that was such a good plan. So I've ended up doing some screen grabs from what I originally posted, which I'll use to support my talk, but I expect I'll wander a bit. I want to actually touch on three areas of comparison. One area of comparison that I'll talk about are goals and mandates associated with open educational resource initiatives. Another has to do with licensing, which you see in the handout, and I'll speak to that in a while. And the last is to do with use cases. If we think about OER having been around for a number of years now, we could consider them being on the technology innovation life cycle. And this is a particular curve for technology adoption, and many of you are probably familiar with this curve. So we could say that open educational resources started out as an innovation at the very beginning of that curve, moved into early adoption, and kind of aspire to move over into the early majority section of this curve. And of course, if you've been following some of Geoffrey Moore's work, you might also be aware of the crossing the chasm notion, where there's a chasm between early adoption and early majority into which some technologies fall and never come out. And I think one of the critical questions facing OER at this stage is, will they cross the chasm and move into early majority, as we all hope they will? One of the ways that will happen is if they get a sustainable business model. And if you've been tracking the OER space, there's a huge amount of discussion about sustainability. And part of that sustainability, of course, will relate to financing and funding. And I thought I'd throw up an actual typical technology financing cycle, which shows the funding formula that is usually applied for technologies, showing seed capital, which is used to start a technology at the very beginning, followed by often angels who provide a second round of funding to keep the thing alive before it can get to the more early stage where venture capitalists might get involved. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that you can kind of think about OER as having similar financing cycle, and I would suggest to you that many institutions who first started into open educational resources did so on the backs of their own seed funding, which got them going. And then to a very large extent, foundations have played the angel investor role for OER. If we think about financing for OER going forward, there's obviously a variety of funding models that could be considered, and I've thrown up some that Stephen Downs has listed and Andy Lane. From a public post-secondary institution perspective, We've heard various sustainability presentations throughout the conference so far that have touched upon some of these particular funding models. The one that I've been particularly part of is the public grant funding from taxes. So the initiative that I lead in Canada is actually funded by the government. And so I thought it'd be interesting to kind of compare foundation versus public taxpayer-funded OER initiatives. And of course, I think for many people, and we heard Hal Plotnick talk about this yesterday, one strategy for sustaining OER going forward is to have them transition to government taxpayer-funded initiatives away from simply being supported by foundations. So I wanted to first, though, talk about the foundation support for OER that has been very much part of the field over the past. And of course, organizations like Hewlett Foundation, Mellon Foundation, Ford Foundation, and more recently the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been really priming the open educational resource pump with grants. And of those particular foundations, I thought I'd just do a short little mini profile of some of them. With Hewlett being easily the kind of granddaddy of them all, having invested the most in terms of grants for this field and played the largest active role. And you can see the list of OER initiatives. Most of these would be the ones that I'm sure most of you are familiar with: MIT OpenCourseWare, Connections, OpenLearn from the UK, etc. And so those initiatives have really kind of gone past seed funding to kind of, a kind of initial startup phase through foundation grants, and there's been millions of dollars invested in those particular initiatives. And one of the things I wanted to reference are the goals and mandates of foundations, because, of course, the money comes with expectations. And so if you look at Hewlett's OER goal, it's to equalize access to knowledge for teachers and students around the globe through open educational resources. If I move on to Mellon, their goals and mandate have largely been around higher education and the humanities. And while they've been involved in the OER space, most of their involvement has really been in the open source software space. So Mellon's made significant grants for things like uPortal, Koali, and Sakai, but they have also partnered with other foundations to invest in OER initiatives such as MIT's OpenCourseWare. And actually, when you look at some foundations, they don't have explicit goals and mandates for OER. They don't actually state our goal for OER is such and such. For Ford, their goals are to strengthen democratic values, reduce poverty and injustice, promote international cooperation, advance human achievement, and they've also been supporting OER. Bill and Melinda Gates, more recently, have been starting to make some investments in open educational resources, and interestingly, they view it as an investment as a kind of disruptive investment, wanting to look at and test whether OER can significantly disrupt traditional teaching methods and increase student engagement. And since I actually published this paper, more recently, Gates has come out with the Next Generation Learning Program, which has a portion of it targeting OpenCourseWare. And if we move from the foundations then to look at the initiatives that they've funded, most of those initiatives do express a variety of goals. So MIT's OpenCourseWare goal is to advance education around the world by publishing MIT courses as a public good for the benefit of all. You can immediately see that there's a correlation or a similarity between the foundation's goals and, in this case, the grantees' goals. And Rice University Connections, they're very much interested in establishing global learning communities that share knowledge. Again, a kind of very much congruent goal with the foundation itself, or the foundations. UK's Open Learning, or Open Learn rather, these are their goals, looking to deploy leading edge learning management tools for learner support, non-formal collaborative learning communities, and looking at enhancing pedagogies for higher education through research-based knowledge. I think many of these goals you'll find have some corollary on the public taxpayer side, but they're not exactly the same. And And that's one of the things I wanted to kind of look at. If we look at Yale, they're publishing their Open Yale courses, and the aim of their project is just to expand access to educational materials for anyone who wishes to learn. And so goals like advance education around the world, publish courses as a public good, connect people into global learning communities, and expand access for all who wish to learn, they align very well with foundation goals, but I guess part of my argument is that they would not necessarily align well with government publicly funded education goals. And so I'd like to shift now and talk briefly about some of the publicly funded OER initiatives which have been less widely featured in the field. So most of you probably are not as familiar with these initiatives as you are with the ones that have been foundation funded. So when I started to write this paper, I actually put the call out to some of the colleagues that I knew were in the field to say, what are the OER initiatives that you're aware of that are actually public taxpayer funded? And this is the list that I got back, or some of the initiatives that I got back. There's the initiative that I'm involved with in Canada. There's several in the U.S., but one in the Southern Regional Education Board, Australia, New Zealand, the U.K., WikiWidge, which has been talked about here at today's conference, and others. And so when I wanted to do an exploration of these, I decided to focus on those that are in the primarily in the higher education space and are developing open education content as opposed to some of the other initiatives which are looking at open education practices or open source software. So I just wanted to contrast some of the goals for the initiatives that I showed earlier with goals for those that are publicly funded. So the BC Campus Open Educational Resource Initiative that I'm involved with, its goals are to foster partnerships between multiple institutions across post-secondary, and also to have those partnerships create OER that lead to credentials. They're very much interested in supporting the credential needs of the citizens in the province. And then, of course, they're also, given its open educational resource framework, interested in sharing and reuse. If we look at the Southern Regional Education Board, again, they want to establish school and college relationships. So there's a very strong interest in establishing multi-institutional relationships within the jurisdiction that is being supported. They also are very much interested in cost effectiveness, reducing duplication, and that kind of thing. And you'll see actually a kind of repetition of that sort of theme of reducing duplication and increasing efficiency with the Australian initiative here as well. New Zealand has been an interesting initiative in that they just recently came out with policy statements about open educational resource initiatives, but they too are seeing part of their goal as being a reduction in the duplication of investment. And JISC in the UK has traditionally had their Jorum initiative, which put in place a repository for sharing these resources, and have recently come out with their own OER initiative, which interestingly is not only interested in sharing and reuse, but also looking at policy and practice, which I think is a really important area for us to start to focus on.
5 minutes.
Thank you. The Netherlands also has their own particular initiative, which I think is quite an interesting one because of it's interesting because it's starting to look at K-12 and post-secondary, but here are the goals associated with them. And so part of what I'm saying is that the goals like increasing credential opportunities for students in the province or establishing school and college relationships and expanding access, those are the kind of goals that really make sense to public funders. But you can perhaps sense some differences between those goals and those of foundations. The licensing then, let's shift to that. You've got the handout. I thought I'd actually just put on a single sheet, going from left to right, the kind of increasingly open licenses that are being used in the OER space. And one of the things you can see immediately in the top cluster are the foundation ones, and they typically are choosing or mandating actually a single license, a Creative Commons license. And then in the bottom are the publicly funded ones where typically there are actually license choices given. And so even in the case of our initiative in Canada, there's typically a Creative Commons option, but also a BC Commons option, which allows for sharing within the province as opposed to globally around the world. So two different licensing approaches. And if we look at use cases and outcomes, the top bullets here show some of the use cases that you typically see associated with foundation initiatives: marketing, informal, non-credit, self-paced study, academic planning, support for developing countries, and in the case of Connections, the creation of print-on-demand textbooks. In the publicly funded context, it's different. OER are typically being used to support formal, credit-based academic offerings rather than informal study. And often the OER are a form of curriculum development, providing faculty with resources or intending to provide faculty with resources to use in their courses. And so there's a very different intent behind the publicly funded OER initiatives. Also, I think I've noticed, certainly from our perspective, that in the public context, OER are uploaded to a repository where they can be searched and downloaded, but typically they're intended for use in an autonomous way through their own learning management system, whereas most of the foundation and other the foundation-supported initiatives actually want you to go to their site, use their technology, and there's not a lot of support for the actual autonomous use and download of that into your own system. I'll wrap up by saying I think there's a way of positioning almost every open educational resource initiative in a strategic framework, which I would suggest has legal components, which has to do with the licensing approach you take, business aspects having to do with funding, technology aspects, academic aspects, and policy aspects. And you can see part of what I've been trying to explore is how to differentiate OER across all those dimensions. And here's a quick snapshot where I compared on the left our initiative in Canada with, on the right, MIT's OpenCourseWare initiative. So from a business point of view, publicly funded versus foundation. Legal, from a license point of view, we give options with our initiative in Canada. There's a single license with the MIT OpenCourseWare initiative. Policy, local goals versus global goals, and so on. And so you can actually begin to differentiate OER initiatives and begin to compare and contrast them using this as a kind of framework. I wanted to close, though, by just suggesting some tactics for those who are looking to establish a publicly funded OER initiative. And so if you want to get public funding for your OER initiative, I think it's important to ensure that you're fulfilling the public funder needs, which largely are around credential needs. And those are really mandatory needs that must be fulfilled first before looking at the global sharing context. I also think that you'd be well advised to explore OER as a multi-institutional partnership as opposed to a sole, a sort of single institutional initiative where one institution, a prestigious institution typically, is publishing its courseware and making it available for others to use. In a publicly funded context, there's always an interest in reducing duplication of effort and a very strong interest in multi-institutional partnerships with each institution using the resource in for-credit offerings. That's often a very strong goal. Yeah, I'll just wrap up. Last couple of points. I would suggest in a public context that if you want to get to the mainstream faculty, you should consider offering some licensing choices along this continuum. And I think that you very much have to look at ensuring that the OER is something that can be easily distributable and has a form factor that is modifiable. A lot of the OER that has been produced so far is actually in a kind of PDF format, which makes it very difficult to modify. And I'll just stop there.